I'm glad to be back to finish up this series that I had the opportunity to start a couple weeks ago called Fracture. And really, this big idea is this idea that we all have fractures in our lives. We want to try to find hope in the pain. How do we do that? Because sometimes we feel like fractures, they really are just an interruption to our story. We've been using this, I would say, definitions so that we can all be on the same page in terms of what we're calling when we say fracture. It's a soul depth crack or break in our stories caused by individual decisions or compressed by external circumstances. This is that big idea that these breaks, these interruptions, these things that happen to us, they're not like the dog chewed up the remote. You know, it's not a bad day kind of thing. It's those things that hurt your soul. It's those things that go down deep. It's the things that truly interrupt your stories, all right? And ultimately, we've heard this every week. We've talked about we've gone back to grammar school, right? We've gone back to elementary school to look at the idea of a story arc. You have all the elements. You have your setup, your action, your climax, your declining action, your resolution. Every story has this. Every one of us has these in our stories. It doesn't the epic stories, right? Frodo gets the ring and starts his quest, and then Luke fires the phase cannon into the small portal, and then it blows up the Death Star, and they escape, and James Bond gets the girl every time, right? So it's like every story, right? Every story has these elements to it. Our stories do as well. The many stories that we have, but it's not just many stories throughout our lives. That our lives are made up of stories. Our lives are made up of stories that actually overlap other stories, and it overlaps it could be parents, it could be parents, it could be your spouse, it could be anything. The stories overlap and intermingle and really cause for us, if one fracture happens there, it actually affects people around you. Have you ever noticed that, the fractures in your life? Your fracture doesn't just affect you. If you're married, it affects your spouse. So it's kind of the same thing. It's one of the reasons why life is messy. It's one of the reasons why, relationships are messy, because all these stories kind of overlap each other. And, well, is that me again? Oh, man. I have to use the other mic again. I don't really need the mic, but it's for recording purposes. No, it's for the stream. I want to make sure the stream hears us. So it's all these stories. And for us, again, we looked at this. This is the example we just gave you of the fracture. It's this break in the story. It doesn't matter where it happens, but it's the break in the story that causes us that pain. That really, if you notice this for a reason, no matter where it happens, the goal of it is to flatline your story. The goal is that you have story arcs throughout your story, but the goal of a fracture is just to really sideline you and flatline any type of movement whatsoever. And we talked about this from day one, that every fracture has a purpose. Every fracture in our lives has a purpose, all right? And that's an opportunity for despair or for hope. I know it's hard to think about that because you think, well, I didn't mean to make those decisions, or I didn't mean to get caught, and so maybe individual decisions are hard because you're thinking, well, I didn't purposefully do that, and then or want this result, and then we think about external circumstances. That hurts our brain even more in terms of we had no control of this. How can there be an underlying purpose? Well, the idea of despair or hope comes from this verse that we've read every week, kind of a key verse. Hopefully you'll have it memorized by the time you finish these 4 weeks. Is John 10:10, and it says that there's a thief. It says there's an enemy, and the thief's only job is to kill, steal, and destroy. But then Jesus, who's talking about this, says, but I have come that you'll have life, and you'll have life to the full, right? That the contrast that's there is that no matter what's happening in your life, especially these fractures, that the underlying purpose is that the enemy wants to use it, the thief wants to use it to steal, kill, and destroy. That's it. That's his end game. That's his only purpose, to flatline and flatline your life and sideline you. But then Jesus says, but I've come that you would have life, not just an existence, but life to the full. We started, and I'll just give a brief recap over the last few weeks. We started with a fundamental truth because we have to be here before we can go anywhere else. And that is understanding the truth that there is absolutely no fracture that God cannot help bear, heal, and redeem, okay? That for some reason, everyone thinks that their issue is so special to them. I don't mean that in a mean way, right? But we don't understand that our fractures are so common. And so we think sometimes that we're alone, and yet that God can't use us, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the reality is that there is no fracture. There's nothing that God can't help you bear. We talked about Joseph. We gave you the example of Joseph's story. To help you bear the burden of it. To help you eventually heal and experience hope and healing through it. And actually redeem it. That there really is no fracture. He can't do all of those things. And then Don, a couple weeks ago, came up and talked about the idea of what it looks like when we, our personal decisions affect this. So personal decisions and unmet expectations from God. The natural tendency is personal decisions that go wrong and the unmet expectations of God that leads us to frustration, shame, disillusionment, and despair. That's the natural pull. That's the reason for those things. And what does it mean to choose hope in the midst of that? And David last week talked a lot about the external, the things you can't control, the things that surround you and really want to take you out. That really we want to work so hard to remove them. We want to do everything we can to remove ourselves from those bad circumstances, to solve it, to get to the resolution that we really need to have so we can kind of get past the fracture. But he shared with us last week that really the hope is not in the absence of those bad circumstances. It's peace in the midst of the storm. That it really is peace that comes beyond our understanding. And so today I want to focus, as we finish this conversation, at least as a church, I want to focus on the idea that not just the bearing the fractured side of it, not just even the healing, how he heals, whether it's our decisions or whether it's external circumstances, how he brings healing, but I want to talk about the big idea about how he redeems. How does redemption come? What does it look like for our stories to be redeemed? So much so that we not just realize that we're living our stories out, but we're actually connected to the larger story. And we've shown you this over the last few weeks as well, so hopefully you've seen this, but that our stories are all connected into the much larger, greater story that God is the author of. That's he's writing in our place. Before we go any further, if you don't hear anything else today, I want you to hear this. One of the greatest things that happens in a fracture, again, from the idea of bringing us to spare hope, one of the greatest things that happens in that moment is that there will be a seed planted in our mind that for some reason, our fracture in our story actually removes us from God's story. That for some reason, the divorce, the moral failure, the mistake we made, the circumstances I couldn't control, but we think that it removes us from God's story and removes us from the greater story. And it couldn't be more of a lie. But it's a seed that would be planted in our hearts and minds to take us down that road to despair. I'm going to give you a little bit of an example of that today. But in order to understand this, and I'm going to put it this way, just in terms of our fractures really do give us an opportunity. This is the way I want to kind of do this. Our fractures really do give us an opportunity to experience the greater story. That you and I might be living stories that, I'll be honest, aren't all that epic or grand. For whatever reason, we may be reduced to just kind of existing in life. We have life, but not life to the full. Our stories really aren't doing very much, but oftentimes our fractures give us an opportunity to choose the greater story. And that's what I kind of want to walk through today as we look at the idea that our fractures are there to help us choose. Now, in order to understand that, you can go put that slide up as well. I don't know if it's working for you. Yeah, opportunities for the greater story. I want to talk a little bit about the idea of story, because the idea of story is not that different than the idea of life. And I know this is going to be a little hard to wrap your mind around, but one of my favorite authors, his name is Donald Miller, and he's written several books. Maybe you've read Blue Like Jazz or some other ones. My favorite book of his is actually called Searching for God Knows What. If you've ever struggled with your faith, if you've ever struggled with some skeptical thoughts, it's a fantastic book, Searching for God Knows What by Donald Miller. It's one I read about once every year or two. I read that book. Anyway, he wrote a book fairly recently about his life. They decided to make Blue Like Jazz into a movie. And so these guys came into his life, these storytellers came into Donald's life and basically had to help him edit his life so that they could put it on the screen and actually make a movie out of it. And it was a hard process. If you read the book, you'll learn the process was very painful for Donald to walk through and actually edit his life and realize how much of his life had to do with story and how much the elements of story really affected his life that he had no idea, no way of really knowing. So I pulled a couple quotes just for us to look at this morning from it's 1,000,000 miles in 1,000 years. But here's the first quote we'll park on. The sum of our ambitions will become the stories that we live. If you want to know what kind of story a person is living, just ask them what they want. If they don't know or don't want anything of value, they're living a boring, stupid story. Now, we don't say stupid at my house because that's the S word to my children, thank God. So that's, right now, that's the way it is. So, but I'm just quoting Donald Miller. Okay, this is what he says. Look, the sum of your ambitions, the sum of the things that you want in life are really dictating the kind of story that you're living, all right? And anytime you want to find out what kind of story someone's living, you just got to ask them, what do they want? What do they really want in life? And if they don't want anything, or, it's like, I just want to get through the end of the week without anybody bothering me. Donald would say, you're living a boring, stupid story. That's what he would say, okay? The story elements apply. Matter of fact, this is what he says later on that I just found very interesting. The truth is if what we choose to do with our lives won't make a story meaningful, it won't make a life meaningful either. Like if you had the opportunity to write into your story, if you had the opportunity, if you felt like it was yours or you were watching an epic story, we all have epic stories that we see. If you had the opportunity to see that, he's basically saying, look, what doesn't make a story, if you don't have anything that's making a story meaningful, then what chances are in your life's not that meaningful either. All right? You ever met those people who just say life is, nothing? You ever met those people that are just like very, Eeyore, and they're just like, life is horrible and life is meaningless and the truth is nobody ever says that about movies. People don't just say, oh, movies are horrible. Every story made is horrible. No, they say that story's horrible. That movie's bad. So when you meet somebody like that, just say, hey, look, life is awesome. Your story stinks. That's what you should just say. Okay, just if the life is meaningless, then just say, probably not. Probably just your life is meaningless, right? Because the elements of those stories really do exist. The two things that he says, and I like this just from a structure standpoint, he says, here's the two common things that every story shares, every epic story, great story shares, is the protagonists always know what they want. Okay, the sum of their ambitions. They always know what they want. If you pause any great movie, it doesn't matter where it is, you know what they want. You pause Lord of the Rings. Am I the only nerd in the room, Lord of the Rings? Okay, so you pause Lord of the Rings, you always know Frodo is trying to destroy the ring, right? Okay, Luke is always trying to, figure out his dad, that whole wound issue, and trying to, destroy the empire. It doesn't matter where you are. The protagonists you always know what they want in the story. Any great epic story. And the other part of it that combines it is that they all embrace at some point their fractures. They all embrace and work through their conflict. You cannot have an epic story. You cannot have a greater story without the conflict. You will not have a life without fractures. But the difference is, and you see them in the great stories that you read or you watch, those stories make them. Those fractures, they didn't break them, they made them. And that's what draws you to it. It's something that just inspires you. And so we have to look at our lives and say, listen, are we living, seriously, are we living lives tied to the greater story that God is writing? Or we have no idea what we want. We have no idea who we are. And when fractures come, they completely derail us. They're not opportunities for us to just remember who we are and that we're tied to a greater story. Today I want to share with you from 2 Samuel. We're actually going to talk about King David again. If you were here over the last few weeks, King David is in the Old Testament, the king of Israel. We've shared David over the last few weeks in different examples. One was David and Bathsheba, bad choices he made when he was the king. Last week, David talked about different times in David's life before he was, when he was being chased by Saul, who was the king at the time, when he was trying to be killed by Saul, and how he handled that, and what it looked like when his son, after he was king, was trying to kill him. So I want to bring in David again today. But David, it's funny, this story, David is not the main character of the story. He's a supporting character in the story, all right? The main character, this is going to be about a story about David and Mephibosheth. Put that up for me real quick. David and Mephibosheth. I want you to say this word with me real quick. Ready? Mephibosheth. Okay? Mephibosheth. Say it with me like you actually are trying. You ready? Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth, right? Okay, now here's the deal. I have to say that word like 20 times today, so don't judge me. That's all I'm going to say, all right? You can't say it either, all right? And if I get really hung up, I'm just going to call him Marty. All right? That's what we're going to do. But this story is about David and Mephibosheth. And for him, This is a kind of obscure story in terms, it doesn't feel like it's all that big of a story, but it is powerful when it comes to how we consider the fractures in our life. Just to give you a quick background, Mephibosheth, he actually experiences some fractures very early on in his life. You find out when you begin to read about him that he is actually the son of Jonathan. Now, Jonathan, if you didn't know about this in just terms of the story, Jonathan is Saul, who was the king of Israel. Jonathan is Saul's son. And Jonathan and David have this, this band of brothers, love and relationship. They're thick as thieves, okay? They are tied together, all right? And they really are. And so Saul's grandson, Jonathan's son, is Mephibosheth. And you find this out pretty early on in his story because his first fractures hit when he's fairly young, and he finds out that Saul, his grandfather, and Jonathan, his dad, and his uncles, they're all killed in battle. And the palace kind of goes into this time Israel's at war, and the palace kind of goes into just kind of a frantic fury of fear, and they kind of flee. And as they're fleeing, we don't fully know the details. There's some speculation, but as they're fleeing, in the midst of them fleeing to Lodabar, Mephibosheth is actually injured. He's actually injured while fleeing. And later on, you find out that he's more or less, he's paralyzed. He's crippled. And so he actually experiences not just spiritual and emotional fractures in his life and the things with his dad and his grandpa and all the things, because he's royalty. As far as bloodline's concerned, he's an heir. He's an heir to the king of Israel. But he experiences those, and then he experiences a physical one, and he's fleeing and really lives most of his life kind of in obscurity. And you find out a little bit later on it's on purpose. So where we pick up in the story, King David's he's already established peace. He's already dealt with some junk with his kids. We're already kind of a little bit into the story. But then you find this out in 2 Samuel 9. If you have your Bibles, turn there. I'll put it on the screen for those that are watching online. It says this. This is where we pick up the story. The king asked him. Him is the Saul's main servant. Okay, so Alfred. You guys all with me on that? Okay, so he asks Alfred. His name's not Alfred. The king asked him, is anyone still alive from Saul's family? If so, I want to show God's kindness to them. And Ziba, that's his name, Ziba replied, yes, one of Jonathan's sons is still alive. He's crippled in both feet. Keep going. Where is he, the king asked. In Lodabar, Ziba told him, at the home of Machir, son of Amiel. That's where he is. So David sent for him and brought him from Machir's home. And it goes to show you, he's not even living in his own home. He's living with someone else. Someone else is putting him up. It says his name was Mephibosheth. And he said he was Jonathan's son and Saul's grandson. When he came to David, he bowed low to the ground in deep respect. David said, greetings, Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth replied, I am your servant. And then he says this, don't be afraid, David said. Now this is the underlying tone that you have to see that's happening in this context, is that when Mephibosheth comes back to King David, there's something there. You see that he's fearful. There's apprehension. There's something in his heart. Like he doesn't just bow with respect because it's respectful. He bows with something else there. And David sees it immediately. He sees this interaction, and he responds to what we don't even see in words. He responds to what's happening in the moment. And his words right after greetings is, hey, don't be afraid. He says, don't be afraid. I intend to show kindness to you because of my promise to your father, Jonathan. I'm going to give you all the property that once belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will eat here with me at the king's table. Mephibosheth bowed respectfully and exclaimed, who is your servant that you should show such kindness to a dead dog like me? This is a remarkable response. It really brings us to light what we're actually seeing that's happening in Mephibosheth's life, is that so much has happened, but really from his fractures, from the fractures that happened physically and emotionally and spiritually in his life, in his childhood. He's living a completely different life. He's got a different state of mind fully. Matter of fact, he is so fractured. He is so sitting in his place of fear and fracture that he actually has already changed his name. I don't know if you knew this or not, but Mephibosheth is not actually his name. When he was born, when he was Jonathan's son, when he was born a prince of Israel, his name was Merib Baal. Merib Baal. Okay, Merib Baal. The name that he was given actually means defier of Baal. And I don't know if you know Baal. Baal's, we talked about that a couple weeks ago with Don. Prophets of Baal, it's a false god, it's an idol, but it's been around for a long time in the Old Testament. And so when he's born, he's Merib. He's Merib Baal. He is the defier of anyone that's not the one true God. He is given a name of strength and of honor as Jonathan's son. But then because of his fractures and because of his fleeing and because of his fear and because of the life he settles into and chooses to live, he changes his name to Mephibosheth, which, believe it or not, means son of shame. Son of shame. That he has been in his fractured state for so long that he has forgotten who he is. And comes before David. I don't know if all he remembered was the fact that Saul, his grandpa, tried to kill David several times. Maybe he didn't hear enough stories about the love that Jonathan and David had for one another and the kinship and the brotherhood that they had. They bled together and fought together. Maybe he didn't hear enough. Maybe he just didn't remember, and the fear overtook him. And he literally changed his name to match the disposition, the state of life that he was living, that he was just nothing but son of shame. So here's this invitation that comes from the king, and he goes, who am I that you would do this? You would do this for a dead dog like me. It goes on, King David recognizes what's happening, and he summons Saul's servant, Ziba, and said, I have given your master's grandson. Okay, so he was Saul's servant, but he says, I've given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. It says, you and your sons and servants are going to farm the land for him to produce food for your master's household. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, he's going to eat with me here at my table. He's going to eat with my table. It says Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Just wanted us to know that, we're talking about the fact that King David says, this is what's going to happen. This is I'm restoring. I'm going to redeem what was taken. I'm going to reinstate all your wealth, all your benefit, all your claim. Matter of fact, Ziba and his sons and all his servants are now yours. They're going to reproduce the wealth, and they're going to work with what was rightfully yours. But guess what? You're going to sit at this table because you are an heir. You are going to sit at this table with me at the king's table. A little later on in verse 12, it says this. Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah, and from then on, all the members of Ziba's household were Mephibosheth's servants. And Mephibosheth, who was crippled in both feet, lived in Jerusalem, and he ate regularly at the king's table. Now, that's not the end of Mephibosheth's story. There's some other things that still happen. Fractures actually still happen in his life. But this is a turning point moment in his life where his story changes. And similar, and I just wanted to give you these two words because I think this is where it's important to look from in light of John 10:10, in light of the thief's goal is to steal, kill, and destroy, and Jesus wants to bring life. That from Mephibosheth's story, you see basically that our fractures really do give us the opportunity that we can change our name or we can change our story. That there's an opportunity to do either depending on what you and I give into. I asked our leadership, some of the staff and life group leaders and some of the folks in our church, I asked them a few weeks ago, I just asked them online, I said, hey, why do you guys feel, answer me this, why do you guys feel like sometimes people have a hard time engaging in the bigger story of God? Why do we struggle to find our hope and engage in that greater story that he's called us to, where we want things of significance, when our ambitions are tied to his and we launch into his story? What causes us not to do that? And I got several responses back, but the one that I kept getting over and over and over again was fear. That fear at its root is so powerful. Fear at its root is so powerful that it can cause us to not simply be derailed by our fractures, not simply be moved out of the way by the fractures in our life, but we can actually forget who we are. That we can get to a place that we are so sitting in the state of our fracture that we change our name. We forget who we are. We change our name to match our life. We begin to live a life of obscurity that really is meaningless. Fear. I even wrote down a few examples, just fear of failing, fear of losing what little control we have, fear of the unknown, fear of not having what it takes, fear of disappointing others, fear of falling behind. Mephibosheth was so driven to fear that he changed his name, literally. Changed his name. Lived in that place until the king called. And he took his fear with him. Even though the king was calling him, the king was basically saying, I'm going to give you a chance to be redeemed. I'm going to redeem those fractures in you. The king calls and says, you're royalty. You don't know who you are, but I know who you are. I'm going to redeem this. I know you've been fractured. I know it's there. Come and sit with me. Come experience what was once yours. David offers him a chance to change his story. I think that for you and I, we have to recognize the part that fear plays. That the enemy wants to use fear to steal our joy, to kill our dreams, to destroy our self-worth and our confidence, and to cause us to forget who we are. If you belong to Jesus, if you've surrendered your life to his, you are a child of the King. That's who you are. No matter what's happened to you, no matter what fracture you're going through, no matter the decisions you've made or the circumstances that come around you, you are a child of the King, and you never need to forget who you are. The fear that comes up and the fear that surrounds us will cause us, in its most powerful way, to want to change our name. To begin to live a life where we don't really experience that much joy, but we don't experience that much pain either. To try to find the route of the safest place and the least resistance, and to do everything that we can to work on our comfort and to make ourselves meaningless. When all the while our stories are linked to his story. All the while our stories are linked to his ultimate purpose for our lives, the ambitions he wants to fill you, the passions he wants to put inside you. All the while, every fracture should be a window, should be an opportunity for us to change our story, not change our name. Every time that those fractures come and we take a step towards hope can be the beginning of a story change, and can begin to link us up to the greater story that he has called us to. I wrote this down because it was just something that was on my heart this week, that, we keep talking about how do we find hope in the pain? How do we find hope in the fractures? And I was just like, in my mind, I just kept hearing God say, you really are you're just one prayer away from it. You're just one prayer away from choosing hope. If you weren't here, one of the ladies who shared in the ladies' gathering back in January, she shared her story with our ladies, and I had the opportunity to hear some of it because Tracy had already gotten some of that story from her. But she had some fractures early in her life, and she was trying to get peace. She was trying to work through those things. She was going to counseling. She was working through some of the steps, the steps in the program, and finally got to a place in her life where basically even the counselor said, "Look, I don't know. I'm not even supposed to say this, but you're doing everything right. But you need Jesus, right? I mean, you're doing everything right, but you need forgiveness. You need hope. You need something that you cannot muster on your own." And up to that point, she exclaims that she detailed that she had not prayed yet to God for that. And so in one prayer, in one turning, she took a step towards hope. She made a choice to hope, and as she'll tell you her story, that made all the difference in the world. Forgiveness came, and health began to come, and more healing began to come, and more began to flood her life. We're always just one prayer. We're always just one moment from choosing that. But fear is so powerful to not just in our fractures, not just make us feel like we're further away from God than we are closer to God, but he will actually want us to forget who we are and forget the greater God story that he's called us to engage and to live. And if every fracture gives us this opportunity, then we have to recognize that for many in the room, I'm going to just be honest, many in the room in here, you've already changed your name. You've already taken some steps in your life because of a fracture as a kid or fracture earlier in your life, a divorce, a failure, a moral failure, an adultery, a failed bad decisions, lies that caught up with you. Because of some things, you've given so much into fear that you've already changed your name. You forgot who you are. You forgot that you're a child of the King. And guess what's so cool? We don't have to wait. Like David had to, establish peace and go through his stuff and his junk before he thought, I want to show kindness to this family. We don't have to wait for God. The invitation is already there. The invitation to wake up every morning and live with intentionality and to wake up on purpose, to humbly point other people to absolute hope, to wake up every morning with the ambitions of your heart and to enter the greater story that you're called to live. It's already there. It already exists. You do not need to wait on it. You just need to take a small step towards it to change your story. And it's okay if you've already changed your name. Mephibosheth went from a defier of Baal to a son of shame, and then in one moment, his story changes. In one moment of accepting the grace that the king offers him, his story changes. That's the same thing that you and I have. Let's change our story. Let's change our story. Let's not give in to fear. Let me tell you, the great stories in life are reserved for those who do not give in to fear. One of my favorite Psalms is Psalms 23, where David, he's writing the Psalm and he says, I will walk through the valley of the shadow of death. I won't fear any evil, for you're with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And he says this, you've prepared a table before me in the presence of my enemies. He's basically saying, you've prepared this life to the full. You've prepared this table because I'm a child of the King. You've prepared something for me to go and enjoy in the presence of fractures, in the presence of danger. I'm not going to get away from it. But it does not keep me. I will not fear. It does not keep me from entering into the fullness and the greater story that you've called me to. Let's change our story. All it takes is a prayer. All it takes is a turning. All it takes is one step to return to Jesus and join the King at his table. To the life, to the full that Jesus came to bring you and me. Let me pray for us this morning. Heavenly Father, we just thank you this morning for your grace. God, that if we're your kids, we are heirs with Christ. That there is a place at the table for us no matter what fracture has ever come in our life. No matter what pain we're currently going through, no matter what we will face in the future, God, the invitation is always there. And you are in the business of redeeming our fractures, of using them to pull us into the greater story that you're calling us to. Oh God, may we know what we want. May the ambitions of our heart be full and linked to the greater story that you're calling us to. And may we embrace those fractures. Embrace the conflicts that are going to come, but choose hope instead of despair. Choose to change our story instead of changing our name. God, it's only by your grace, it's only by your power, it's only in coming to you, first and foremost, that you give us the courage. That you give us the courage to step out when we're not comfortable and live a life that is meaningful and full. We pray all this and we respond in worship to you, Jesus. Amen.
We hope you've enjoyed your experience with Journey today. If you would like to invest in the mission and ministry of Journey Church, you can easily give by going to thejourneyonline.com/give. Also, if you've been changed by absolute hope, we want to hear your story. Please take a quick moment to share your story by writing to stories@thejourneyonline.com. Thanks again for watching.